Hey guys, this video is for APUS. If you didn't watch the video that I left you yesterday, please go back and do that. It's called 1944. And then after you watch that from start to finish, uh, then watch this video. If you did watch the video yesterday, then keep watching this one. Okay, so we left off yesterday talking about Franklin Roosevelt, who's in very poor health by this time, suffering from congestive heart failure, coronary artery disease, exhausted by managing the war effort. Had just won a fourth term in the 1944 presidential election. So now the challenges just continue. In many ways, they're more immense because not only did Roosevelt have to manage the end of the war, which is still going on, but he had to figure out some plan for the post war peace. What is that going to look like? Especially when U.S. interests, U.S. concerns are going to conflict with the needs, desires, wants of our erstwhile Soviet allies, right? Because the United States and the Soviets were allies during World War II, opposed to the Nazis, but we have completely different sets of government kinds of government, different values, and a completely different vision for what the post-war world was going to look like. And it was all about to come to a head. Now, in December 1944, the Germans, realizing they were losing the Second World War, D-Day happened in June 1944. The Allied forces made their way through France, were approaching Germany itself. And Germany made one last attempt to try to push back the Allied advance, and that was the Battle of the Bulge. Now, Germany put everything they had into stopping the Allied advance because the Allies were about to go from France into Germany itself. Now, a movie was made about this, The Longest Day, which was a really popular movie in the early 60s. And the battle, which lasted for weeks, was absolutely intense because this was basically Germany in its death throes, right? And they realized that if they failed here, they were going to lose the war. So the United States wound up suffering 55,000 casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. But ultimately, as we know, the Allies were successful and began their march into Germany. Now, on January 20th, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt took the oath of office for a fourth term as president. Now, remember, Roosevelt was in very ill health, and he really was not up to the trip to the Capitol to actually, to actually do the inauguration, where it usually takes place, as we know from a few weeks ago. But Roosevelt decided to hold the inauguration at the White House. Now, Roosevelt used the pretense of saying that, well, we shouldn't be celebrating an inauguration with the war going on. So let's just have a simple inauguration here at the White House. When, I'm sure that was a reason, but another reason was the fact that there was real concern whether Roosevelt could actually make the trip over to the Capitol for the inauguration. He hadn't even been wearing his braces. Remember, he couldn't walk, and he used to wear braces on his legs that kind of held him up. He hadn't worn his braces for so long, and he had lost so much weight that the braces actually didn't fit. So Roosevelt actually put his braces on for the inauguration ceremony at the White House in 1945. And it caused him considerable discomfort during the ceremony, which actually did not last very long. Roosevelt's fourth inaugural address was only 500 words, and Roosevelt really did not have the energy to actually go all out for a full inauguration. So he made his way back to the White House, basically collapsed in the White House, had really bad chest pains, was very weak, and also 2 days after his fourth inauguration as president, Roosevelt had to embark on a 7,000-mile trip to the Soviet Union, where he was going to meet with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill at the Yalta Conference. Now, Roosevelt actually wanted, and the Americans were trying to lobby for a location that was a little bit closer, but Stalin gave a whole bunch of excuses why the inauguration couldn't be held anywhere but Russia. Stalin was petrified of flying, and Roosevelt and Stalin actually sorry about that. Stalin actually hesitated to actually make any long plane trips. Also, Stalin was hoping that having the conference in Yalta, which is in the Crimea, in Russia, would actually give him a bit of a home field advantage as well. So Roosevelt did make his way to Yalta despite his health situation, and there were some really big decisions that had to be made at Yalta. Now, back during the Tehran conference in 1943, FDR had actually promised Stalin, you know, influence in the post-war reconstruction of both Germany and Eastern Europe, and also the Russians promised that they would enter the war against Japan. Now, that is sometimes forgotten about, in post-war histories. The real need for the United States and the Allies to actually have Russia enter the war against Japan. Because, we did not have the atomic bomb yet. We anticipated a long, drawn-out battle, defeating the Japanese. And we, excuse me, and we needed Russian assistance. So keep that in mind when we talk about some of the concessions that were actually made to the Russians at Yalta. Some of the reasons for those concessions, was the fact that we really needed the Russians to help us against Japan. Now, the decisions that FDR and Churchill, to a degree, made at Yalta are still extremely controversial, even to this day. Conservatives who are not fans of FDR for many reasons often fault him for really poor decisions at Yalta that gave too much influence to the Soviet Union. But that criticism isn't entirely fair, so we'll talk about that. Now, the Yalta Conference was February 1945. It took days and days for Roosevelt actually to get there to Yalta. Now, the Soviets had tremendous advantages when the Yalta Conference started. First of all, remember, the Soviets had been marching toward Germany since they pushed the Germans back at Stalingrad. And on their way to Germany, they took over the countries of Eastern Europe and basically occupied the countries of Eastern Europe, especially Poland. Now, Poland is especially important to the Allies because remember, that's the whole reason World War II started, right? Because the Germans invaded Poland. That's why Germany and France declared war on Germany to begin with. So the fate of Poland was really on the minds of the Allies. Now, the Soviets had already installed a very pro-Soviet government, a communist-friendly government in Poland already. Now, they also had established, governments of some form in most of the countries of Eastern Europe because they marched through those countries on their way to Germany and took over those countries. So basically, they have control over Czechoslovakia, over Hungary, over Romania, and Bulgaria and the countries of Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia. Now, they were deep into Austria-Hungary. They were only 50 miles from Berlin itself when the Allies met at Yalta. Now, many Allied American officials, especially the military, were desperate for a Soviet assurance that they would, or reassurance that they would actually enter the war against Japan. So that's why some concessions were made at Yalta that need. But also, the Soviets already controlled Eastern Europe. So people later said, well, FDR gave the Russians Eastern Europe, but that's not true. At worst, all that the United States and Roosevelt did was recognize the inevitable, that the Russians already had Eastern Europe. So we didn't give it to them. They already were there. So they had enormous leverage. And FDR and Churchill ultimately did agree to allow the Soviets to stay in Eastern Europe in return for a promise that free elections would be held. But the details of that were very vague, and Stalin had no intention of keeping that promise. In the meantime, the pro-Soviet government had already been installed in Poland and actually had a chance to kind of settle. Free elections were never ultimately held in Eastern Europe. Elections of some sort weren't held until 1947, and the elections that were held, basically only candidates approved by Russia the Soviets could actually even participate. So a lot of people looking at that really criticize Roosevelt, saying that why would he believe Stalin? Why would he basically give him control over Eastern Europe in this way? But there are reasons. One, was what we said, that we needed Soviet help to defeat the Japanese. Also, they already had Eastern Europe, so he's not giving it to them. But one thing you maybe can fault Roosevelt for is Roosevelt always did have a kind of naive view of Joseph Stalin. He always thought he could manage Stalin, charm him, convince him, cajole him, or whatever. And that was never going to happen, right? Because Stalin was Stalin. So Roosevelt perhaps had an overly optimistic idea of how he could deal with Stalin, but the other decisions that really were made at Yalta, which even Churchill was more conservative generally than FDR, defended the decisions there, even though he kind of felt like he was out of the loop a lot. Like he felt that Stalin and Roosevelt were the ones that were making real decisions, keeping the British almost as a junior partner. But Churchill, at least in the immediate aftermath of Yalta, basically said that this is the best we could do. Now, another reason why Roosevelt felt as strongly as he did that an agreement had to be made at Yalta was he was desperate for the Soviet Union to commit to joining the new United Nations. Now, the United Nations, remember, Roosevelt's a Wilsonian, so the United Nations was key to Roosevelt's vision for a post-war peace. The idea that all the countries will get together and resolve differences, and this would be a way to prevent future wars. And the Soviets were being a little bit coy about how involved they wanted to be, if at all, in the United Nations. So another reason why concessions were made to the Soviet Union was because we really needed them to join the United Nations. And ultimately, they did commit to the United Nations, but they would get a veto over all decisions made in the Soviet Union. Remember, there are 5 members of the UN Security Council that have a veto that can block anything from happening, and the Soviet Union would be given one of those seats. Soviets agree that 2 to 3 months after the war with Germany ended, whenever that would be, they would enter the war against Japan. And the Yalta agreements also gave all the Allies spheres of influence in Germany. So once Germany was defeated, the Brits, the Americans, and the Soviets would all have a sphere of influence in Germany. And the Brits and the Americans also insisted that the French be given an occupation zone in Germany, which Russia wasn't very thrilled about agreeing, considering, the very mixed record of the French during the Second World War, but ultimately that was agreed to. After the war was over, a few years after the war was over, the British, French, and the American sectors united to form the country of West Germany. The Soviets kept control over their sphere of influence, and that became the communist East Germany. Now, was Yalta a sellout? That's always the question. Historians really go back and forth on this, right? Often it's influenced by ideology. It's whether somebody's a liberal or conservative. Also, it's and the way they feel about FDR generally. Also, there's a lot of hindsight involved in analysis of Yalta. After the fact, right? We know what happened. The Cold War began after the Yalta Agreement. So the thing is that looking back at Yalta, a lot of people can really afford to criticize, the decisions that were made, but because we know what happened afterwards, the people at Yalta didn't. And honestly, as anti-communist as I am personally, I really do not see any other option for Roosevelt than the deal that he made. Some critics say Roosevelt was in such ill health that he really wasn't in any position to really make any agreements with the Soviet Union, that he actually wasn't thinking clearly. Some people said he had really bad days when he used to zone out and really could not really focus on what was going on, while other days he was sharp. So some people say that Roosevelt in his health condition really, made some very poor decisions. But honestly, I really don't think any other decisions could be made, unfortunately, because the people of Eastern Europe were entitled to actually have their freedom, right? And that ultimately was denied to them by the Soviet Union for 45 years. Roosevelt ultimately returned to the United States from Yalta absolutely exhausted. And the thing is that on the trip back to the United States, a very close friend of his actually died, on the trip back. Another friend of his, Harry Hopkins, who literally had been with him since the early days of the New Deal, was very ill with cancer and complications from cancer, and actually then got really annoyed with Roosevelt and ultimately didn't finish the trip with him. So Roosevelt actually was not in the best of moods, coming back to the United States, and also in very, very, very poor health. And Roosevelt actually decided to address Congress to tell them what agreements he had reached at Yalta, and he actually sat down while addressing Congress, which is the first time ever he had really done something like that, especially in such a large forum, right? Because Roosevelt railed against his paralysis his whole life, and really didn't want people to see, that he was really unable to walk. But in his health situation, he really did not have the energy to stand. And he actually said right before he started his speech, I hope you'll pardon me for my unusual posture of sitting down, but I hope you'll realize I have 10 pounds of steel on both of my legs. And that was the first and really only public admission that Roosevelt ever gave of his disability. And a lot of people watching the speech in Congress, telling them about Yalta, were really shocked by not only Roosevelt's physical appearance, but also by the fact that the speech did not really have the typical Roosevelt touch. So the good news was that the end of the war is in sight. The U.S. was pushing its way into Germany from this direction. The Russians were pushing into Germany from the opposite direction. So the end of the war is finally in sight. All right, guys. So we're gonna stop right here. So remember, I hope you watch this video from start to finish, and also the video I left you yesterday. In tomorrow's class, Thursday's class, we're going to talk about the aftermath of Yalta, and also the tragedy that happened on April 12th, 1945. All right, I will see you all on Thursday. Peace.